The Lord of the Rings you saw wasn't the original one. From scrapped storylines to characters that were never introduced, there were a lot of hidden chapters and lost plans of Lord of the Rings that never saw the light of day. Little twists and tweaks meant we never saw the original Lord of the Rings. But how was the original plan different? What did the director miss out? Let's dive in and find out what the original movie could have been like. You might think that J.R.R. Tolkien had everything figured out for The Lord of the Rings from the start, as if he had a perfect map in his mind. However, even though he had already created the vast world of the Silmarillion before starting The Hobbit, the actual story of The Lord of the Rings changed a lot as he wrote it. Tolkien's legendary tales had crazy ideas that didn't make it into the final books, which would have changed even how the movie was made. One such concept was the notion of good orcs and the Wizard King. Yes, you heard that right. Good orc. During his dangerous journey, Tolkien had imagined a scene where Frodo would encounter orcs who weren't evil. This idea came from Tolkien's personal beliefs as a devout Catholic. He argued that an entire species could not be deemed irredeemably evil. For him, every creature had the capacity for good, reflecting his faith's emphasis on redemption and moral complexity. However, as the story of The Lord of the Rings developed, Tolkien found it challenging to include these benevolent orcs in the narrative. The complexities of the plot and the overarching theme of the battle between good and evil left little room for gray areas in the portrayal of orcs, traditionally seen as the epitome of villainy in Middle-earth. Wild, right? Interestingly, this idea of good orcs briefly sprang up in a dream sequence in the Rankin-Bass animated adaptation of The Return of the King, showcasing what could have been a unique twist in Tolkien's world. Additionally, in the early drafts, the Witch King, the fearsome leader of the Nazgul, was initially called the Wizard King. Gandalf, the beloved wizard, was terrified of him not merely due to his power, but because he was once a wizard himself. He had belonged to the same order as Gandalf, but had succumbed entirely to Sauron's corruption, turning him into a formidable enemy. Tolkien eventually rethought this character's backstory. He decided that the Istari, or the Order of Wizards to which Gandalf and Saruman belonged, were not human but rather spiritual beings sent by the Valar, the godlike entities in Tolkien's universe. To avoid confusion and to clearly distinguish the Witch King from the benevolent wizards, Tolkien renamed him from Wizard King to Witch King, and it was this change that helped reinforce the distinct nature of the Nazgul, aligning them more closely with the dark powers of Sauron. But can you pause to imagine how differently it could have been? While you're at that, we'd tell you a secret most fans do not know. A secret that would have changed the movie we all saw and loved. Lord of the Rings would have had a different director. Now, that's shocking. Back in 1968, Peter Jackson was just a 6-year-old kid, totally unaware of a decision that would later play a huge role in shaping his career as a famed director. That year, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author behind the epic fantasy The Lord of the Rings, turned down the Beatles. Yes, the legendary rock band wanted to create a film adaptation of Tolkien's masterpiece, but the author needed to be on board with the idea. Can you imagine how different things might have been if the Beatles had been given the green light to direct The Lord of the Rings? It's fun to think about how a Beatles version of Frodo's journey to destroy the One Ring might have looked and sounded. Fast forward 36 years from that decisive moment, and we find Peter Jackson making cinematic history with his own adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. In 2004, the final film in his trilogy, The Return of the King, achieved an extraordinary feat. It tied the record for the most Oscar wins in one year, scooping up 11 awards, including Best Director for Jackson. All of this was from a project that could have had a very different past had the Beatles led the way. The Return of the King was an epic film, but did you know there are some critical differences between the movie and J.R.R. Tolkien's book? Even that has left some pretty exciting stories untold. One such is the Death of Saruman. In Tolkien's book, Saruman's fate is sealed much later in the story. He meets his end in Hobbiton towards the very finale of the saga. However, Peter Jackson, the film series director, chose not to include this part of the story, known as the Scouring of the Shire. The filmmakers were in a dilemma because they couldn't leave Saruman indefinitely in Orthanc, with Treebeard the Ent standing guard. So what did they do? They decided to handle Saruman's storyline differently. The scenes featuring Christopher Lee, who played Saruman, were moved to the film's extended edition instead of the theatrical release. Why did they make this choice? The film's theatrical version was already over 3 hours long, clocking in at 201 minutes, so they felt adding even a few more minutes to include Saruman's conclusion might make it too long for cinemagoers. If you've watched the extended version of The Return of the King, you've seen how things wrap up for Saruman and his sneaky associate, Grima Wormtongue. It was Legolas, the elf, who shoots Grima with an arrow, bringing an end to all Saruman's schemes. Christopher Lee, the legendary actor who played Saruman, was quite disappointed that these scenes were cut from the film's main theatrical release. And he wasn't the only one upset by this decision. Many fans and viewers shared his sentiment. But many fans don't know that wasn't all. There were order plans that didn't make it to the theater. For example, Strider was originally Trotter. In Tolkien's early drafts, Bree wasn't quite like the Bree we know. It was a town entirely populated by hobbits. But these weren't just any hobbits. They were darker-skinned, more brutal, and notably plumper. Imagine this. Butterbur, the innkeeper, was described as the fattest hobbit ever seen by Bingo. Now, here's where it gets super interesting. In Bree, the hobbits still bump into a mysterious wanderer who knows much about the wizard Gandalf. However, instead of the rugged Strider we all know, this character is a hobbit named Trotter. And guess what? Trotter is no ordinary hobbit. He's a total badass. Trotter is still a ranger, but in this early version, rangers just meant hobbits who didn't settle down in houses. Instead, they lived wherever they found a comfortable hole. They were like hobbits with a wild streak, almost like they were the adventurers or the rebels of the hobbit world. Trotter got his name because he wore wooden shoes that made a trotting sound as he walked, which is pretty odd, right? After all, everyone knows hobbits usually go barefoot. But in the notes Tolkien jotted down, he floated a groundbreaking idea. Trotter didn't just wear wooden shoes as a quirky choice. They were actually prosthetics because he had no feet. Imagine that. Tolkien almost introduced the first amputee fantasy hero. That would have been incredible. However, he ultimately replaced Trotter with Strider, the character we know today, and we missed out on what could have been a truly unique character in fantasy history. Bet you never knew you could have gotten something that incredible. There's more. In the original plan, we could also see that Treebeard once held the hobbits captive. Everyone knows Treebeard, the gentle giant of an Ent from The Lord of the Rings, who speaks slowly, but has the strength to take down Isengard. But did you know he wasn't always the friendly giant we admire today? Originally, Treebeard was called Giant Treebeard, and he was quite different. More like the traditional giants you hear about in fairy tales, which means he wasn't all that nice. Unlike in the final version, where Treebeard becomes an ally, he stayed neutral and somewhat hostile in these early drafts, particularly disliking anyone trespassing on his territory. In fact, it was initially Treebeard, not Saruman, who prevented Gandalf from meeting up with the hobbits. Gandalf, Frodo, and Sam eventually escaped from him, though Tolkien didn't detail how they managed this. It was very early in his writing process, and the story had more of the light, whimsical feel of The Hobbit than the epic tone The Lord of the Rings would eventually have. This likely led to Tolkien revising Treebeard's character as the storyline became less centered around the hobbits and more complex overall. As Tolkien's ideas evolved, he reimagined Treebeard as a giant and a more benevolent figure. There's a captivating draft where this kinder Treebeard carries Frodo across the Black Mountains to the Siege of Ond, an early version of what would become Gondor. This glimpse into Treebeard's character evolution would have been fascinating, as it shows him first as a traditional giant and later as something more unique, a giant with the essence of nature, almost like a plant elemental, which is quite different from the character we know from Peter Jackson's films. Speaking about the film and differences, the original plan had a different plot for Aragorn, a plan we didn't get to see, and it was all about a romance with Éowyn. Tolkien isn't exactly known for weaving romantic tales into his epic adventures, but he included a love triangle in his stories. Fans were a bit let down when Aragorn ended up with Arwen in the final version of the story. But why so? It's easy to miss the sparks between Aragorn and Arwen when reading the book because she's only in a few scenes. On the other hand, Éowyn has a much more prominent role. The reason for this difference is quite surprising. Arwen actually didn't exist in Tolkien's original drafts. Initially, the story went that when Aragorn first laid eyes on Éowyn at Meduseld, there was an instant mutual attraction. This setup provided more opportunities for their relationship to develop in the narrative, making Éowyn's presence more significant than Arwen's later and more subtle introduction into the tale. Now, imagine if Tolkien had gone with an Aragorn-Éowyn romance. How would that have played out? Éowyn could have joined the Fellowship or at least traveled alongside Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. It's fun to think about whether she might have journeyed with them through the haunting paths of the dead. And what about her disguise as Durnhelm? Would Aragorn or any of the Dunedain have been tricked by it? These are exciting questions left for your imagination to answer. Which of these stories would you have really loved to see? Let us know your thoughts in the comment sections below. Also, hit the like and subscribe buttons to get updated on more exciting content from us.